I'm going to focus around the business aspect of farmers' return and particularly tenant farmers' returns, and take you through a few of the things that we're seeing and indeed we're thinking for our sort of client base and others in the industry that we're involved with. I'm going to cover off a number of areas in this sort of next 15 or 20 minutes. First and foremost, performance. I think that is sort of first and foremost in all of our requirements at present in agriculture, having had one difficult year and heading into another difficult year, courtesy of the weather we've had to endure the last 4 or 5, 6 weeks since the end of September. Collaboration, which will come up in some discussion, I think. Diversification and some landlord-tenant ideas, perhaps for collaboration, or more than ideas, projects that we've seen work between landlord and tenant, and areas that I think the tenanted sector and with best intention should try and encourage landlord engagement around, for reasons that we'll talk about when we come to that particular part of the presentation. And I've been in this business for 30 plus years, and I think there are undoubtedly some pretty big changes ahead. Perhaps the biggest ones that I've seen in that period of time, really brought on by this change in support structure that Greg's alluded to. And last but not least, at the end, we'll just talk a bit about this likely flip in land supply and demand balance, which may be a surprise to some, and certainly won't be what landlords or landlords agents want to hear, but I really do think that's going to come over the next 2 or 3 years as the reality of the difficulties that the industry has in generating net margins on some land types and some crop and land use positions comes home to roost, really. And I think, from my point of view, it's being ahead of that as tenant farmers and trying to encourage tenant farmers to be proactive about taking control of that. That's the main thrust. A little bit about Brown&Co for those of you who don't know. I'm sure, well, I hope anyway, most do. We've got 12 offices up and down the middle and eastern side of the country, circa 250 staff. Predominantly involved in agriculture, both from a land agency perspective and also from a farm business consultancy perspective. We've got a BPS list of about 1,300 that we undertook or undertake annually, including this year. And we've got a footprint for our overall ag relationships around the firm about 350,000 hectares. We've got some international perspective on things, which has been relevant all along, but I think is particularly relevant over the last few years since the Brexit vote, and in terms of where we're heading and the focus, I think, of what we're trying to get out of land use, be it as tenant farmers, share farmers, contract farmers, or owner-occupiers. We can learn a few lessons, I think, from some of those some experiences we've had in very difficult countries where they've had negative support and still do have through export retention taxes, etc., where the focus is very much about net margin. Reiterate that I'm certainly not here to tell everybody what to do, nor in our main line of work really, but hopefully to give people pointers and direction around the future and how to manage the change in these changing times and the volatility that now is all around us in virtually every market sector that all of us are involved in agriculture. What folks do is obviously up to them, but really headlining on this macro change in ag support, which is really very serious for the industry. Which I'll touch on briefly during this presentation. I've nicked this slide, no apology for that, from a chap called David Hinges from Rural Solutions in South Australia, who we've done a bit of work with, and some of you perhaps might have heard him on a platform over here 5 or 6 years ago, with his normal sort of Australian sharp delivery, no holds barred delivery really, around taking control of farmers and landowners and land users and share farmers taking control of their own future really, as opposed to blaming and having excuses and denying everything that's going on around them. And whilst that's not a pop at anybody or anything, it's easy to fall into that trap. I think these next 2 or 3 years of adjustment for the industry, it's absolutely vital that we take control of that and have responsibility for seeing those areas of change through to impact on our own businesses, as opposed to thinking it might be somebody else and happening to somebody else. And certainly that's true of the tenanted sector, because it's probably going to be the sector under most pressure most quickly through this period of change. So that's another David's slide, the last one. His sort of denial paddock, as he calls it, through to confusion of what do we do? Do we embark on mid-tier or don't we? Do we give up a tenancy or don't we? Do we take more land or not? the breakthrough moment really, and seeing the horizon and then his final contentment paddock. So I'd ask you just to keep those sort of 4 stages of the process in mind as we hop through this. But I think it's pretty pertinent to where we are in the industry at the moment, and particularly, as I say, with these 2 quite difficult years that we've had from a weather perspective. Just a reminder of BPS impact on UK net farm income, so it's effectively net profit. So it's 3.2 billion out of something a bit over 5 billion, which I'm sure it won't be, NFI won't be that in the 21 year because of the harvest we've just had. But it's a major element of the bottom line, and that's really the point. Why make an apology for making a big deal of the changes that are ahead, and how as an industry do we adapt to those changes, and particularly for tenants. Greg talked about the HDB farm bench work that we and various others do. And the only thing I want to draw attention to there is the red line across, or the red bars across the middle of that stack bar. We've not done the 2020 farm bench work yet. We've started to do some of our own sort of benchmarking around our own costed farms and consulting farms. But the point I want to make really is this whole operating cost structure, and that's total labour and machinery is the red bar there in the middle, ranging from a little under £400 a hectare up to 459, but I'm quite sure all of you will know, and I certainly know of many farm businesses which have got operating cost structures much higher than that. And I think all of us in the industry have some blame here for really not perhaps focusing on OPEX as much as we could have done or should have done in the past. And we've seen those numbers double effectively over the last decade. And you all know that in terms of machinery prices and operating costs for machinery, which largely drives that, and depreciation, but obviously also labour. And I think being aware of whole farm margin, net farm margin, rather more than anybody has in the past, and everybody's been focused on gross margin, is what we've absolutely got to get to grips with. And certainly in our Argentina farming arrangements and our Russian farming arrangements, where we have an involvement with operators there, it's all about net margin. If they can't make a net margin, they don't do anything. And I think that's rapidly where we're heading, particularly with elms coming, or indeed mid-tier before it, which gives us other options that aren't about farming all the land all the time. So diving into a bit of detail behind some of that, to reiterate this point really, that's a simple spreadsheets that we use on a sort of forecasting basis, simplistic forecasting basis really, to particularly at the moment when we're looking at mid-tier schemes, or perhaps thinking about land options or tenanted land options, extra tenanted land that either do or don't deliver any profits to the operator or the tenant. So simple gross output around the top for these 4 crops on a 1,000-acre unit, yield and price, as you can see, this is a 21 crop budget effectively. Variable costs all used to that in terms of what they might do, and obviously having a bit of a debate at the moment around sugar beet because of the terrible harvest we're also going to have for sugar beet this year. Didn't suffer last autumn's weather conditions, but it has suffered severe difficulty in establishment, everybody will know, and indeed on virus yellow's impact. In fact, I think British Sugar's own view is that we're going to be 20% down on yield this year, so we certainly won't be doing 75 tonnes as an average. But again, the point being, forgetting about gross margins to a large extent and starting to really hone in on operating costs and net margins, this mid-green line here. This is after labour and machinery only, just to break that down into pounds per acre if people want it, £190 an acre, 468 a hectare. So it's not a high number, it's certainly not a low number. All of us are guilty of thinking we're going to farm land perhaps for £100 an acre operating cost, or £150 an operating cost. Some do, most don't, I suggest. It's much, much higher than that. And again, just as a little tool that attributes those operating costs across these 5 crops in the rotation, and then sort of truths them, if you like, with the actual operating costs of the business. And I've got some target numbers in here for this particular example. 35 is an easy number for me to remember, and it's one I think is pretty relevant. £35 an acre in old money, or £90 a hectare in new money, for fuel, repairs and depreciation. They're hard targets to hit, but there are targets that we've got to hit, as this slide demonstrates really, and they're not impossible, but lots of people are a lot higher than that. And then if you then look at a typical rental cost, which might, in this example, have got £100 an acre, 247 a hectare, or a finance cost if one's an owner operator, but for a tenant, yes, £100 an acre is probably on the high side, or the higher side of quit AHA 86 Act holdings. which might be £75 to £100, depending on the level of fixed equipment, housing, etc. But it's certainly not a high figure for FBT, as everybody will know, some significantly higher than that. But if you then deduct that average cost across the business, another £350 a hectare, you'll see that actually pre-BPS and other forms of income that the tenant farmer might be lucky enough to have, the picture looks pretty grim. And that's why, and particularly for sugar beet, I might add, but that's why I think it's important that we start to focus everybody, and particularly if we're in a tenanted situation, where our net margin is going to come from as BPS starts to fall away. Because on ordinary land, in ordinary situations, and certain positions in the rotation just are not really contributing any net profit delivery, forgetting about BPS, which I think we can afford to do because we don't have to produce crops or indeed crop the land to receive BPS payments. So that's, I apologise for labouring it a bit, but I think actually I make no real apology for it because it's something the industry has got to get much more used to looking at, and indeed including in the customers of the industry, either when they're trying to sell kit or if they're trying to buy a crop. What is the point in us putting crops in the ground if we are not going to make any money from it? So contribution to profit, that's just the same information graphically really, and you can see the sort of orange or yellow golden line there indicating relatively little levels of net profit in that particular rotation of those yields, and those yields were not yields generally achieved in 20 years, everybody will know. Sort of moving that conversation on to tendering perhaps for farm business tenancy land, which typically might be around available for 3 to 5 year tender opportunities, and this is where I think this flip in supply and demand is going to change. Well, I'm sure lots of people on this call will disagree with that, but I'll try and explain my rationale for that. So this deals again with similar levels of yield, nothing fancy, but pretty respectable, and price and variable costs. Typically the gross margin, nobody knows about gross margins, £780 a hectare on a 100 hectare unit, £78,000. If you take away typical marginal operating costs of £370 a hectare, you see in that third column from the left over here, and then we also bake in, as it were, the reduction in BPS that we're expecting. We know we're going to get 10% for modest sized schemes next year. We don't know exactly how that fall is going to follow, but we know we're going to have nothing by 2027. So assuming these reductions, what net margin, pre-rent margin does that leave with a level of marginal fixed costs, I hasten to add, for these extra hectares that have been added. And we'll see, still perhaps quite a healthy margin of 60 trading to £50,000 for that additional 100 hectares. So important for holding a core holding, perhaps an 86 Act tenanted holding, which needs additional income to shore up its viability. And we've all been doing that and chasing that hard over the last 20 years, I suggest. But if we then take off a rent of also a similar £150 an acre, similar to the operating costs, and that's not to be lost. I think those similar sort of shares of cost carry and responsibility at around £150 an acre are something not to lose sight of in terms of how we might try and share that pie in the future between landlord and tenant. But if you look at that pre-rent margin, deduct the rent, and then look at the net margin available afterwards, it really doesn't come down to very, very much. 25,000 forecast in 21, down to 10,000 in 25 as the BPS starts to slide. And if you then look at the bottom of that slide at this risk analysis, where we perhaps have a 10 to 20% hit on output because of weather conditions that we've just had, market prices, as we know we're on a volatile, topsy-turvy on cereal market at the moment, from the highs of wheat to the lows of barley, we can see that the actual net additional contribution to profit is really not very much. And so the flag I'm waving there is, I think we should all be careful about tender rents, and we should all be careful about taking on extra land, because it's not a given that it's going to produce extra profit back to the host business or the host tenanted business. So drivers for change and perhaps solutions or pointers for tenants, which I recognise is a different, one of the most difficult areas of the industry, I think are going to have the most difficulty, which is why we're doing this work with DEFRA. First and foremost, identify actual performance levels. Where are we in our business versus others? HDB, free of charge, reasonably succinct. Okay, it's fairly generic in many ways, but it does allow one to look at the business versus competitors and peers and see where we are and what could be done perhaps to improve, or if things can't be done to improve, making decisions around that. So production economics and net earning capacity of specific land holdings, absolutely crucial. Everybody will know that's a vital part of rent reviews. It's probably early on the journey to be flicking sort of rent review notices out left, right and centre from a tenant's perspective. But I think it's not that early. We're coming to the time because we know BPS is going to go. We've had a difficult harvest and a difficult year in 20, and 21 may not be much better as a result of the last 6 weeks of weather. So we're certainly coming up to that time, and I think there needs to be debate about what is the correct rental level for a particular holding. Engagement with landlord, crucial on that. We'll come to that a bit towards the end. Taking control of business and your specific business. We talked about that right at the outside with my Australian friend David's and a blunt delivery around it. And making sure that your business isn't just a sort of recipient of a sales industry, which is far better equipped than any of us in agriculture are, be that machinery and equipment salespeople or be that input salespeople. And bearing in mind this transition through change in ag is going to impact very heavily on them as well. But we've all got to get off this treadmill of just putting more and more costs into agriculture because it's leading us down the wrong direction, and in fact to a direction of ruin if we're not careful in reversing it. Tendering for land, focus on margins, mentioned that just a minute ago. And rent reviews will be required, and they will be going down as BPS falls away, in my opinion. I think we'll have some mixed views around our firm about that, I'm quite sure, but generally I think the thrust is as BPS falls away, rents will have to change, and that will be a downward direction. Now, they won't change on their own without proactive effort from tenants and tenants' agents and negotiation and discussion with landlords, and they won't change on their own without tender rents being looked at very carefully in terms of what level of profit they deliver to the tenant that's doing the operations on those additional holdings. So last point on that slide, engagement with landlords to share impact of lost revenues is crucial, and working up projects perhaps with landlords' involvement, we'll talk about that in a minute, where we can come up with strategies to safeguard both tenants and landlords' returns. You know, we're all in this together. I think gone are the days where landlords are just sitting there waiting for tenants to sort of hand in the keys. You know, I was involved in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was a bit of that went on heavy land, difficult farms. Wheat was, you know, sub £60 a tonne for several years, and tenants were in trouble. And I think we're going to get to that point again now, but we need to be ahead of that. And I think we're in a new era around general landlord-tenant relationships, I would suggest, to look at other opportunities that operators are needed for, tenant farmers are needed for, landlord can't do on their own. And I think there are several opportunities that nearly every tenant can or should be looking at. So I'm not going to talk about that in any depth, but strategies for change on the left-hand side really about production and production economics, and on the right-hand side really about what we can do to do things that are not related to production. You know, we've all been on this sort of hamster wheel of chasing production and chasing yield. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, as long as we're aware of what the cost of that yield is and whether it's actually achievable in terms of delivering a net margin. So all of us, including me and clients I'm heavily involved, we've been chasing contract farming arrangements, chasing FBT land, as I said, for the last 20 years. And for most of that time, that's been quite successful. Right now, it's a sector that's got a problem because those net marginal returns are not generally meeting the additional costs of carrying out that extra farming activity. And so I think the CFA model is set to change, I would suggest. And these, on the right-hand side in the red there, there's diversification operations that have been available and opportunities have been available, often funded by grant schemes, and an awful lot of that ourselves over the last 5 and 10 years for farming clients, and stewardship too, you know, large-scale stewardship, which have taken land out of production or put points in the rotation, take loss-making points in the rotation out of production, have been very beneficial to generating net returns on holdings, but of course long schemes need landlord's consent. So strategies for change around diversification. And obviously where we're doing sort of structural change on holdings, you know, landlord's consent often, if not always, required. But I think, again, most enlightened landlords and landlords agents, I think, will treat approaches from tenants these days with diversification projects in mind generally pretty positively, because they want to safeguard their rent and they want to safeguard the future of their tenant. And I think there are some great opportunities for that at the moment that need both parties' engagement. And I think, again, looking on some grade 3 and worse farms where we've got mediocre soils and mediocre crop margins, you know, looking at other diversification activities and land use activities, perhaps, that might involve others, specialist land users, outdoor pigs, for example, or specialist land uses around mid-tier and perhaps elms to come, again, long schemes requiring landlord's consent, I think we should be looking at those very positively at the moment, not necessarily waiting for elms, getting on board with mid-tier if we're struggling to show net margins on these mediocre soils. Capital grants, they're going to be part of the new support measures, already been announced that they will be. Haven't got the details of all of that yet, but we have had some capital grants in the last 3 or 4 years that various businesses have embraced. And getting the landlord on board, and I'll show a few examples where we've been quite involved with encouraging landlord investment in buildings that are under a tenanted holding, but to build diversification income on the farm, perhaps where landlords put materials in and tenants pay for labour, or perhaps where the landlord has funded the whole of the conversion, but the tenant is then responsible for managing that business in that converted facility, or just managing the rent roll that comes into it. There's lots of opportunity there to build additional income on holdings, both within the agricultural sector, we'll see in a minute, and outside it. Location, obviously important, crucial, and as I say, our experience would be often these new enterprises, additional enterprises, have been led by the next generation. And certainly I've been sceptical about that for probably 15 of the last 20 years, slightly less than that. But over the last 5 or 7 or 8 years, where digital marketing platforms, engagement with the consumer of whatever form they may be, has been much, much easier. Some of these enterprises on tenanted holdings and freehold holdings have been very impressive indeed, starting from very small beginnings. And last point there is a good time to invest, and the landlord will see that. Money is cheap as chips at the moment, difficult for tenant to borrow long and large chunks of capital, perhaps into fixed asset projects, although not impossible, depending on balance sheet and depending on track record, but certainly very easy for the landlord to do that. And that's where, again, this tenant-landlord relationship is crucial and engagement is crucial. So a couple of examples there on sort of fun parks and animal visit centres and cycleways that have been done on collaborative projects between landlord and tenant. As I said, tenants often constrained access to debt. It's difficult, and it's going to get more difficult, I think, in that market in the short term, although money is cheap. We've seen a change in the banking attitude, I think, to tenant lending over the last 5 or 6 years. And I don't see that reversing, I'm afraid. And so I think having a good, strong P&L account, having some capital reserves, but also being involved with the landlord. If you've got big capital projects to do, get the landlord involved, because they can secure long-term debt. And it's a great time to do that with interest rates as they are. And the landlord should be worried. He should be as worried, if not more worried than the tenant. People might scoff at the thought that we're going to see an increase in supply and perhaps not sufficient operators, let's call us operators at the moment, tenant farmers, share farmers, to take up some of those opportunities. But I honestly think that's what's coming, because the net margins are so fine on some of these land types and some of the rotational positions. And so I think when that flips, in 2 or 3 years' time, as BPS falls away, we're going to see a slightly different level of conversation, I think, between landlord and tenant as to how we generate sensible levels of rent for the landlord and sustainable profits for tenant farmers in the future. And that's not going to happen without embracing with elms, replacing mid-tier, in my view. And last point, I don't really see why rents won't fall in line with direct reductions in overall support. None of us are saying we have no support in 2027, but I think it will be foolhardy to expect it to be the level of support we've got into the industry now, roughly 80 to 90 pounds an acre, 220 to 240 a hectare. I suspect it's going to be more likely a third of that number that we might rely on as a generic broad acre level of support. So just in terms of strategic change, as I said, I think we'll see a flip in land supply and the ability of willing tenants, or the queue of willing tenants, to bid hard for land. So that should be a bit of a red flag for landlords. Obviously, if one's on tenanted holding, there's 6 out. The last thing I want to do is do anything that risks the tenancy. So it's absolutely crucial to stay in business and operating those farms. And again, we saw this change in the early 90s. But collaboration with the landlord, I think, around their access to those low-cost capital, their ability to give consent for large capital projects is crucial. But they need an operator, and very often they want an operator, and a successful operator, to make it happen. It's not going to happen on its own. Machinery and labour sharing arrangements, we've all seen lots of those over the last few years, and I think again that's going to come to the fore. I also think through some of the inside track with DEFRA that we're going to see some collaborative benefit grant funding, perhaps as we've seen in the PO groups, producer organisations in the past, which could be quite exciting, and again a driver for collaboration to drive efficiency and productivity on farm. But I think the whole farm CFA model is possibly under threat, certainly if it's not structured correctly, because operating costs have gone up massively. And I think when one looks long and hard at sizable contract farming arrangements and look at the net profit actually delivered to operators, it's pretty marginal, whereas landlords are often receiving 150 to 200 pounds an acre. We do see share farming return as something that was lost really with the McSharry reforms in the early 90s because of this, dual sort of occupancy or operations of the land, and wasn't possible under IACS and subsequently the BPS as well. But I think share farming, where we're genuinely sharing risk and reward, we've seen some of that in livestock operations already, I think is going to be on the up. And remember, share farming was a real saviour out of the collapse of the industry in New Zealand in the 80s. So I don't think it's fanciful thinking on our part. Net earning capacity, we talked about that, and working together and having collaborative schemes, perhaps around longer term land use change that might come under mid-tier. And remember, we can go into mid-tier annually, we can move straight across to higher tier, to ELM, from mid-tier to higher tier if those schemes prove to be more beneficial than the mid-tier scheme that you locked into. But mid-tier is a good scheme. That's why I've done 220 or 30 of them this year. So one sort of macro example of landlord-tenant collaboration. We've been quite involved in the broader sector the last 5 or 6 years, and in one particular situation where we've had a landlord provide all of the investment monies, circa, again, the 4 million quid. We've had a tenant adding to his core holding the providing a rental return to the landlord for that investment, and then operating the broader unit under contract with one of the big integrators, and it does work. Provides good level of return on investment for the landlord, provides a very beneficial additional significant income to the tenant operator. So that would be a larger example. Smaller example, outdoor pig finishing, sort of not exclusively East Anglia, but there's been a lot of that in East Anglia as the outdoor herd has grown substantially, with Brexit interrupting or potentially interrupting pork supply to the UK. It's a good opportunity for the UK pig market to expand, but the shorter finishing capacity, again on Alba units, 220 to 250k, a building of this type provides useful additional revenue and good return on capital for the tenant or the landlord if one's working with the landlord to invest in it, and useful work for employees or the tenant himself as well. So that's worked extremely well. Got several examples of that around BQPs, Base, Cranswick, Pedder Pigs, or smaller projects in maybe traditional buildings that have got absolutely zero significance for existing farming activity in the modern world. And I looked at some of those myself in Shropshire on yesterday, but where they've got significant opportunity for conversion, commercial conversion, to provide rental revenue, to landlord to fund conversion, to tenants to shore up his income for what's happening in his farmyard on his doorstep. And again, locally based, on-ground based tenants, operators, often best to find those subtenants, if you like, for commercial buildings. Clearly landlord's consent is required, so don't try this at home, focus on your own without landlord's consent, but a real opportunity. And way back in the early 90s, heavily involved with that with church commissioners on one of their tenanted estates, myself in the south of England, with tenants where, again, at that time it was very much needed to shore up tenants' net farm incomes. Glamping, everybody would have heard lots about glamping, great opportunity at the moment. Done a lot of it over the last 4 or 5 years on both freehold and tenanted holdings, doing a lot of it at the moment on the last grant round, waiting for the next grant round to unfold. So there are some real opportunities that grants have unlocked and made easy the capital investment to do and develop some really significant returns on capital and extra net margin to core holdings. So I think getting close to wrapping up, our view very much, and it's in the public domain really, in terms of what DEFRA's policy is saying, that there are going to be capital grants as part of this transition period. And a lot of those will be focused on productivity and efficiency gains. I mentioned possibly the opportunity of capital grants for equipment. We saw that on no-till and strict-till equipment over the last 3 years, and maybe we'll see it on more traditional operational capacity where groups of farmers are collaborating together in order to drive out efficiency gains in their businesses. Revenue employment creation has been a big thing around capital grants over the last 3 or 4 years of grants through the RPA, and we shall see that again, I'm quite sure. We've had a couple of early share farming adoptions at quite big scale on traditional grassland as part of a larger estate, where tenants have found it difficult to work conventionally to pay a sensible level of rent, or indeed a landlord might have been finding it difficult to work up a net positive margin from livestock operations. But where we've had the lands being accepted as having very little net earning capacity at all, but landlords have been prepared to invest some money in livestock alongside share farmers or operators, and some of these are new operators, some of them have already got a base flock or herd of their own. And we're seeing increasing opportunities for that, and I see that being tied to mid-tier stewardship and high-tier stewardship and elms as is coming, as we see the net earning capacity from traditional arable use of perhaps marginal grade 3 or worse land, making no money for anybody, and putting down a whole field option under one of the stewardship options that are available, and having a livestock system in place with effectively a nil rent, no rent being paid, but a share of net revenues has been something that we see happening a lot more. And we've already had 2 of those opportunities at scale already set up in the last 2 years. Typically, landowner providing land and buildings, rent-free, share farm providing expertise, capacity, and operating machinery and labour, and a revenue or margin return split on inputs and outputs. Again, it's a model we had an awful lot of in the late 80s, early 90s, but Shannon did away with it, and I think it'll come back, not just for the livestock sector. So takeaway messages really, absolutely crucial to look at net margin and competitive ability for one's existing business. Got to take control of this in terms of how we're going to manage change over the next 3 or 4 years as BPS drifts away, and be in front of that change rather than being behind it and at the mercy of what comes. Map out those transition impacts on individual businesses. We can help with that, and we do all the time. We've done on many businesses in the past, and there are others, not just us. I appreciate that, but it's something we do an awful lot of in our team of over 30 farm advisors. Identify opportunities to improve performance and net margin. Recognise if that net margin is marginal or negative. Stop doing it immediately. There's really no excuse. Mid-tier is a great option for whole field and whole field scale margin delivery at £550, £500 a hectare, which we're not doing on many net margins in crop agriculture at the moment. Look at diversification projects, engage with landlords, and diversify away from pure ag production unless we're really competitive on competitive soils and really good at what we're doing. And look at strengths and weaknesses pretty realistically and pretty cruelly, you might say, if one's looking at one's own business. And discuss concerns over profit of the landlord now, ahead of rent notices flying around in any direction, because I think we'll find most landlords and enlightened agents are willing to have that debate. The industry should be worried, and it's not just that pressure shouldn't just be on the tenants. And seeking out advice and guidance before doing anything radical. Remember, terms and conditions of individual tenancies, consents for change is something that's got to be got right. And so take advice from TFA, others, tenant agents and farm advisors, but engagement with landlord absolutely crucial. Thank you for listening.